Hello, everyone. This is Fabian and our new product designer, talking a little bit about Geo and how it works and what it does and how the interface looks, and essentially giving a quick tour of the product with hopefully a lot of questions on why things are the way they are and how they look. Okay, so the first thing is, I think for Geo, the way we've structured the product at the moment is essentially to cover two very broad use cases. And they're actually quite different, and they have different requirements. The first one is about geo replication. This is why it is named Geo. And the idea from sort of a, let's say, user perspective is that if customers of GitLab have offices in several different countries, then having a single GitLab instance in one country will potentially decrease the productivity of teams that are remote, right? So in other geolocations. And so in order to improve the user experience, and especially with the focus on sort of faster pull operations, so downloading data from a GitLab instance, we spin up Geo replica servers in a different environment. And the idea there is really that, let's say, if we make an example, actually, like I can pull up the documentation because that's maybe a little bit more visual. I'll jump right into the architecture. Let me share my screen. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you, for example, look at this architecture diagram here, you can have a primary node in, for example, North America and a secondary node in Europe. And this means that in North America, let's say the main office of our customer is in North America, they will have a primary located relatively close by, for example, on the East Coast. And then they have a secondary node in Europe, which the European developers can actually use in order to download data, for example. And that means that they are in a position where it essentially is just as fast to work with GitLab in Europe as it is in the United States. That's kind of the first really big use case for Geo. And you can already see this is accomplished by different mechanisms. So for example, you have, this is sort of the internal GitLab architecture. You have a Postgres database where we store all sorts of interesting things. And then you have other bits like authentication. You have artifacts stored in object storage. So for example, things that people upload to GitLab, or stuff that is generated when a continuous integration pipeline is built. And also, obviously, we have repositories, so the actual Git repositories and wikis that need to be replicated. So Geo essentially allows to do this on a continuous basis. So every time a change happens on the primary, it will be forwarded to the secondary. The important point here is that the secondary is read-only. So you cannot actually change any sort of state on the secondary. You can only read from it. And that is maybe something we can change in the future, but at the moment, the complexity involved with having several different like read and write writable GitLab instances is quite significant, given that we use Postgres. So you could imagine, for example, if both of those were writable and you make a change here, how do you know that nothing was changed on the other side in the meantime, right? So it's a relatively involved process. So the secondaries are only readable. But, and this is I think relevant to you, and this is sort of my vision for this, we don't really want this to be very explicit for users in Europe, right? At the moment, a lot of the complexity of all of this here is kind of exposed to users, because they kind of need to know in many cases that they are using a secondary. The secondary may have a different name, right, than the primary. The web interface on the secondary is also only readable. It is not writable. So if people want to use the web interface, they actually have to go to the primary. So there's a lot of sort of like exposure of developers to understand sort of these internal concepts. But my vision for this is ultimately it would be great if the user experience of using GitLab is essentially the same wherever you are, right? So that everybody can contribute from wherever they actually are. And so in the last month, we've already gone a little bit closer to that for Git operations, because what can already happen is when people pull data from the secondary, that works. And they can also push to the secondary, but the request actually gets sort of proxied over here. So nothing happens on the secondary, but it gets sort of forwarded to the other primary, which is quite neat, because you are essentially able to use the secondary as if it was writable for those operations, which is already a big improvement. And we also now support certain sort of deployment modes where you can give like a single name for your primary and your secondary for Git traffic. So it would be something like git.customer.com. And then there is a load balancer that can actually say, oh, when the users in North America say this, they should go to the primary. But if somebody says this in Europe, they should go to the European server, right? So it like automatically decides, which is quite neat, because then you don't need to remember like what name you have to use. And so that's sort of the number one scenario. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm writing the notes on the paper, so
sure.
bear with me. Yeah.
Any questions at this point?
Not yet.
Okay, cool. So this is sort of the number one high-level scenario. The number two scenario is that once you have a secondary node here, you may be in a position to use this as a disaster recovery solution, right? Because you could, if you replicate all of your data, in case the primary here actually has a failure, maybe planned or unplanned, the time it could take you to recover could be lower, because you can essentially then take your secondary and make it into a primary. Right? So that's another operation that we look at, sort of Geo as a contributing factor to a disaster recovery and business continuity plan. And so there's obviously complexity involved, right? You need to think about how do you make a secondary into a primary, right? What does that involve? Is that easy? Is it difficult, right? And at the moment, this is all relatively manual. So people need to go to the command line and they need to enter commands, right, in order to accomplish this. But it's not easy to, for example, go to the user interface and say, hey, I am in this situation. I would like to promote my secondary to become a primary. Nor is it specifically like easy again to, for example, restore your primary as a secondary, right? So there's a lot of sort of process that needs to be thought through. And I think there's a lot of usability and automation improvements that we can make. And that's sort of on the menu at the moment for Geo, something that I would like to do with the team. And that may mean that we ultimately would like to add some of those capabilities to the user interface as well as to the command line. And that's kind of Geo in a nutshell. Those two things.
Okay.
On a high level, there are a lot of intricacies to this. right? As in the devil is often in the detail when it comes to replicating those data, because replication is not necessarily super straightforward, right? You transmit those data over the internet. It needs to be robust, right? You need to be able to retry and verify. People rely on this being quite stable. So from an engineering perspective, this is an interesting problem, right? And so if you go, for example, down here, we have current limitations, where you can sort of see all the sort of data that GitLab generates, repositories, projects, and then look at sort of the support for Geo, right? So we don't actually replicate everything yet, which is something that we would like to do in the future. So that's something to keep in mind.
So I have one question regarding the disaster case.
Yes.
So you mentioned that if user wants to promote secondary to primary, so for now they had to use the terminal, but there's no way to handle the situation on the web.
No.
But what I'm wondering is, so is this the only case if certain user wants to promote secondary to primary, the situation is just a disaster, or could it be other situation like?
No, it also can be other situations. So, and this is also something that we actually want to look at now. As part of business continuity plans, sometimes customers may choose to do this not only in the case of a disaster, but also on a regular interval to test their ability to actually do this. So that is sort of a planned mode where you have your primary and your secondary, and they are on different infrastructure, and you want to essentially establish that you can perform this procedure within a certain time objective without losing any data as part of this sort of practice. And I've actually spoken to a customer yesterday that also uses this for upgrades, essentially. It doesn't really use Geo, right? But it's a consideration where essentially you have two different GitLab instances, and you want to be sure that when you upgrade, nothing affects your working system. So you copy everything over, right, to a second side, you upgrade, you make sure that everything works, and then you switch over. And at the moment, for example, there is no good support for some kind of maintenance mode, because the problem that you have is, let's say here, if you are in this situation and you have the primary and the secondary, sometimes there's a lag between the state on the primary and what is on the secondary, because it still needs to be copied over, right? Yeah. And so if you just switch off the primary, you will lose some data, right? And so you need to, if you do a planned thing, you need to be sure that everything is actually copied, right? And you're sort of in a state where everything is identical now, which means that you have to restrict what happens on the primary in some form. And so at the moment, that's also only possible in sort of a command line mode, but it doesn't allow for a sort of a maintenance mode where you can say, hey, we are going to do a planned failover, you will not be able to change anything, or maybe not log in or anything like that. That's really not something that we support, which I would like to do very soon.
Okay, because why I'm asking this question is if the context change, probably I was just assuming that user might also change. I mean, imagine the case only for the disaster case. And probably I thought that the user might be sysadmin or the DevOps.
Yes.
But if the case for the upgrading, I was not so sure if the user role has changed. So different user comes and then they do something
exactly
different.
And I think we have essentially, like from a user perspective, there are, let's say there are two groups, right? We have systems administrators who essentially are tasked with setting up GitLab and setting up GitLab, maybe with disaster recovery capabilities or with geo-replication abilities. They need to administrate the system, maintain the system, install it, upgrade it, all of those different tasks. So, and when you will see when we talk to our customers, often we talk to, like when I talk to them, I talk to the systems administrators because they are concerned with disaster recovery and things like that. But then, we have a second group, especially for the geo-replication use case, which are all of the regular users of GitLab, right, in a different geolocation.
Yes.
Right? And they are just, they're not systems administrators. They have no access to the Geo administrator panel, right? Or they may even not have an understanding of what Geo is. They just want to use GitLab for whatever task they need to perform. But they get frustrated because, let's say they are in a different location, Europe or Asia or wherever, far away from the primary, and GitLab may just be really, really slow, right? So for them, it's a performance question, right? And they want to do their tasks quickly. So those are the two main user groups.
Yeah. Cool, thanks.
Yeah. So that's that. I'll show you Geo in a second, like a Geo installation. So you can actually see from a systems administrator point how it looks, but I'll also show you a little bit how it looks from a user perspective. I think one thing to know is if you look at this from sort of a product perspective, we have a lot of documentation, right? But it is actually not necessarily very like there's a lot of information for users to digest, right? So I'll give you an example. If we go to setup instructions, so how to actually set up Geo, right? You have like 7 different like pages of what you need to go through, right? So for example, you need to do like a GitLab installation first, right? In whatever way you choose to install it, right? Then you need to set up database replication at some point, right? Which is, there is a lot of, like, I mean, you can see here, there's a ton of command line interaction. So from my experience and looking at the support tickets, we get a lot of support questions, when people are trying to set up Geo for the first time, right? That's really a difficult thing to do. So there may be a lot of opportunity in the future to simplify that, which is also in sort of collaboration with your distribution team, right? Because it's sort of a mixed bag. Yeah, there's a lot of manual like work to be done, and it gets complicated because you can deploy Geo in various different configurations, right? With high availability scenarios, and I can walk you through that. It's a little bit involved, but it is not like most of these things are not actually able to be performed in a user interface other than the command line. So graphical user interfaces, not a thing really at this moment in time. So yeah, so that's a challenge. I can show you Geo now if you would like.
Yeah, sure, please.
Cool. Okay, so I have sort of a Fabian demo version of GitLab signed out, installed, that I can walk you through. And so one thing that you can see is like I'm here on sort of the secondary Geo server, right? So if we go back to our thing, I'm on this node here, the secondary. And you can see already sort of here, it gives you a little notification saying I am on a, okay, I'm not quite sure what happened here. I'm on a read-only Geo node. And what you can do is, and this is now the perspective from sort of a regular user, right? You can go through the interface here, you can look at things, right? You can go to your projects, for example. You can, let's say you can create a project, this is interesting. First design challenge. What do you think happens when I do this?
I don't think I can create a project in the secondary node, actually.
Yeah, you can't, but you can do this.
What?
Okay. So
yeah,
these are some of the challenges that we have in this interface, because I think I have done this at least 10 times myself, where you see the banner, of course, but you can't actually, like, then you can still sort of edit the interface, but you can't really save anything because it's a read-only repository. But what we can do is we can go to the primary node, and now we're here, right? The notification is gone, and I can say, okay, I'll create a project now. With a README.
And then, yeah.
Now it works. And it gives you a bunch of, like other notifications. But if I now go to the secondary, you can see this is already here. Yep. And that is exactly what happens when you have Geo, right? It already replicated super fast, yeah. And now we can, for example, say, here's, we can look at issues here, right? There are no issues. If I go to the primary, right, and I make an issue, this is the new issue we made, right? And now we can refresh here, and you can see it was synced.
Okay.
That is how that works.
So when I'm in the secondary node, I cannot create a new issue here.
No, you can click on it. You can do all of this, but if you submit it, error.
Okay.
So that's, for example, something where we need to think about how sensible is this. And I think this is also, I have a little bit of user research scheduled, because I don't know if anyone is actually using this interface, right? Because you could imagine that as a user, this is not so helpful other than looking at things, right? But you must go to the primary node if you actually want to use, if you want to make any kind of change, right? So my question is how much sense does this interface actually make at the moment, right? That's a very basic question to establish.
Yeah.
So, but that's that. You can also, and I think this is now, yeah, that's kind of the user bits. Because I'm an admin, right? I can go to the admin area now, which is here.
Yep.
And you can see we need to update, and maybe if we have a tiny bit of time, I can actually do that for you. But here you see the Geo admin interface. And this is where you can see there is sort of a status, a status message. And like you can see how many Geo nodes do you have, right? You have a secondary, you have a primary. You can look at the verification status. other information, so how many replication slots there are. This is sort of the information that we display to systems administrators, right? And for example, this year is quite important because it essentially tells systems administrators how much of my data that was generated on the primary was synchronized to the secondary.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is sort of our dashboard. You can see the events that are like processed, right? So you can see like the last change was 2 minutes ago. You can get some verification information, because it's not only about the about replication, it's also about making sure that what was transferred is actually not corrupted, right? So that's another thing. Yeah, some other information here. Yeah, you can perform some actions, right? You can change some settings for the node here, but there are many more settings in the command line and GitLab RB. You have this new node button, which is a little bit of a lie, because if I just give it a name and a URL, it does not actually add a new node. Right? You must have a lot of configuration already done previously in the command line to be able to use this.
Oh, okay.
Right? So that's another sort of question, is like, if somebody wanted to add a new node here, what would that look like, right, in the future? So that's this. We are on the primary, right? So this is everything that is displayed on the primary, and you can see here this actually has been checksummed now, so it updated. It's a little bit. It's not. Yeah, I don't know how this is implemented in the Rails side of things, but it sometimes takes a little while to update. Now, if you go to the secondary, I can use this like open projects link here. I'm being moved to the secondary, and the secondary looks almost the same, right? So the top interface here is very similar, right? But you have more information. So if, for example, you have projects, and you can now see on the secondary, it's like, okay, what was actually synced? When was it synced? Do I want to resync or re-verify? So there are certain tasks that systems administrators can perform here, even like some batch operations. For example, you can resync all projects or re-verify all projects. You have like this layout here where you can like look at only synced ones, pending ones, failed ones, never. So it allows systems administrators to perform like a very limited set of operations. This is for projects. But there's also uploads, right? So you can have like attachments or LFS files that are being, right? So the problem is, for example, from a user experience perspective, if we go back to our sort of current limitations, we have a lot of different things we want to sync, and we have a lot of potential actions user like administrators would like to perform on them. But every time we add something new, we could make a new entry here, right? And just essentially copy paste this interface, which is what we do now, because it's simple, but we don't know if this is actually a good idea, right? And I've spoken to some customers, and they are not necessarily happy with this view and the tasks that they are able to perform. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to redesign this and make it easier for people, for systems administrators to perform the tasks that they want to perform.
Yeah.
And so that's number one. And it's also about sort of surfacing the right information in the right way, right? So for example, like this verification information here, is this useful, right? What are people trying to get out of seeing this, right?
Well, actually, that was what I what I have in mind to ask you back. Like, for example, if you see on the screen like repository checksum progress, wiki progress, and in the other information is like replication slots, something. But like I was going to ask you, like, is there any like hierarchy for this information, or like something is more important for them and something is less important for them? And the other question is like, now the health status is fortunately healthy, but if this is changed to something else like yellowish or the red like warning,
Yes.
then probably some of the information might be more important than the others.
Yes, that's actually 100% true. So I don't know necessarily for all of our users what the hierarchy of information is. I have some personal guesses, right, that we would need to validate. Repositories are often quite important. LFS objects are more important. But it really depends, and it may depend on the customer. Mm-hmm. But I can say for sure that if people see this screen, mm-hmm. and let's say repositories have a, like, the way this is being shown is, you can basically, I can't show you right now, it's like here will be like a little red portion, mm-hmm. right, of like non-synced, mm-hmm. right? And so as soon as things are not 100% synced, mm-hmm. and like people want to know why,
yeah,
right? And then the systems administrators, in my experience, want to be able to do something, right? And say like, okay, the reason why this is red could be this or this or this. Mm-hmm. And in order to do this, I can now ideally go to the interface and say like, hey, I'm going to, let's say, resync the last changes, mm-hmm. and I can solve my problem. But more often than not, people are not sure what to do in order to sort of solve this for themselves, which then means they contact support. Mm-hmm. Because and I've seen this, I can send you some support tickets. I've seen this like several times where, you know, essentially we get a screenshot of this, mm-hmm. and people say like, hey, my LFS objects are only 70% synced. I don't know why, but I really need them to be synced. Yeah. Right? Or, you know, and how you arrive at that is also interesting. It's like, was it 100% at some point? Did it never actually hit 100%, right? Like, what can be done? Like, all of those are really interesting questions.
So, meaning that, like, not only this figure here that I saw, this is important, and they might be want to see other, like, I don't know, like history logs. I mean,
yes.
So it was like hit the 100% like 3 hours ago, but for some reason it goes down, and then.
Yes, that's also, I think, true. Like, because I think sometimes what we get is as well, people, like, something changes, right? They've upgraded the GitLab version, right? Or, you know, like having monitoring capabilities, right? Of saying, like, for the last 7 days, right? Everything, you know, like was always 100%, or, you know, if something new happened, it actually like synced within 5 minutes, mm-hmm. right? Or the average lag time between my primary and my secondary over the last day was 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. Now it's 10 minutes, right? Maybe that's an alert, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of sort of monitoring, or like, yeah, I think it's the full blown requirements. Like, people want to know the current state. They want to see the history. They want to know what is normal, right? By what definition? You know, like, what can I do when things are not normal, right? So how do I like solve problems, right? And having that information is available in some form of interface is quite helpful to people. Mm-hmm. But I would say in a vast majority of cases, in order to fix your problem, you can't actually fix it here in the user interface. Mm-hmm. You have to like look up the Geo troubleshooting guide, right, which we have, for example, here. Where it's like, okay, you know, like, what are like the health checks, right? Is something like wrong, right? There are command line tools here, like Geo check, right, that you can run. Mm-hmm. But this is not available in the interface, for example, mm-hmm. right? You can then like get like a status, like something similar here, right, in the command line that you can see on the on the web interface. And then like there's all sorts of like, hey, these are the things you can do in order to help you resolve this issue. But this is like, you have to read through this, right? And you have to like know that it exists and all of those things. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think the state that we are in here with this is we know that there's a lot of like things that we need to improve here. And I think we have a good customer base to talk to, but we haven't yet sort of focused more holistically on solving this as a like overall sort of problem of how this could be. I think we've been quite opportunistic and small and like said like, oh, we do this and we do this here, right? And that's been good, but there are, for example, no experience guidelines or baselines for our users yet, right? And I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done to say like, hey, what are the top 5 tasks that people like systems administrators going to the web interface actually have, right? And I think that's going to be a really huge and really interesting opportunity to figure out.
Of course. Very nice.
And that's the spin.
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing.
I actually really like the product. I mean, of course, I cannot understand the whole thing like a developer, of course, but I think that's okay. There pretty soon. Hope.
Yeah. Well, I've spent a long time trying to understand a lot of this, and it is sometimes quite involved on the technical level. So it takes a little bit of time.
Yeah, but I really hope I can reach to my goal. And can I give you the very quick feedback, I mean UX, UI wise, because sure. I could find something like in general, like for example, like I don't think it's a good user experience to provide something which could not work. Like for example, for the read-only modes, like I thought that like, okay, create a project or create a new issue on the secondary node is not possible. But users still can see the buttons there, which is enabled state.
Yes.
Meaning like, yeah, okay, this is clickable, so it will lead me to the another web page. So if they click on it, still there's no other like visual cues like, okay, you cannot do it here. Of course, there's a like banner like, okay, this is read-only mode, but I think that's like not enough. But I think in this case, I need to do more user research or
yes.
Users.
I can send you an issue because I think for me, I have the same concerns, but I also, and I think this is like an interest, like this is sort of a more basic question. It's like, who uses this web interface, right? It's like,
it's more because fundamental level.
It's a fundamental question that I have, and that I'm very behind in answering this, but I've reached out to some customers recently. I'll get you up to speed to maybe conduct some interviews to tease that out, because that's also from a product question. It's like we know that we will need to support systems administrators logging onto a user interface on the secondary, but maybe in a large like proportion of the use cases, the users, the actual sort of GitLab users, will go to the primary first because they can do all the things they need to do. And the user experience of that is acceptable to them, right? Maybe that's the case, right? Yeah. And if that's the case, then we don't need to like spend a lot of time optimizing the experience on the secondary. But I don't know that, right? And this is a very sort of important decision, I think, because we could also, and people have tried to do it on a technical level, try to make the secondary web interface appear as if it is writable, right? And maybe do some trickery where you every time somebody clicks a button, you send them to the primary, right? So it looks very similar, but it's really not, right? And there are some things that you could do but maybe like on a fundamental level, I would like to know what is actually happening, because like, and I think this is something where, yeah, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? But I see support tickets for people struggling with the systems administrator interface. And I see that they say like, oh, I don't understand how this works. But I've not seen a single ticket in the last 6 months from somebody complaining about the read-only interface, right? So I'm a little bit like, is this because people just don't care, right? Or is it because nobody notices because nobody uses it? I don't know. So
I think if possible, like if I could get the data, of course, this could be great. But if this is not possible, I mean, it's worth to ask user. I mean, it's very important for me to understand their like actual context behind this UI.
Yeah. So we can talk about it, because we have the opportunity to maybe conduct some user interviews inside a customer organization.
Yeah, sure. I would love to join. Yeah. Actually, not join. I should conduct.
Yes, but that's, for example, something that that's sort of on my mind. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that's Geo in a nutshell. And yeah, we can talk about the roadmap at a different point in time. But on a very high level, I think we are going to focus a little bit more on disaster recovery, enabling Geo on GitLab.com, reworking how we like add and verify data. And that's an engineering heavy effort. But I also, and this is where you come in, I would love to redesign, well, redesign is the wrong word, understand the tasks that systems administrators need to perform in the web interface, and then really think about how we can improve the experience there, because I think that's a lot of the exposure the UI gets, and it may be used for some really important tasks, like business critical decisions, right? So it needs to be robust. Yeah. So happy to be to have you on the team. So
thank you.
Cool. All right. Do you have any more questions? Otherwise, I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, I think it's okay to stop sharing.
Cool.
And I will make some notes after this meeting on the Google Drive, not to forget about this detail.
Yes, it is probably worthwhile capturing it in issues on GitLab.
Okay.
Because that makes it easy for the team to see what you're thinking about. And I can run you through like next week or so, like where and how to do that. Because then it makes it easy for everyone to contribute to those discussions, and they're public as well. That's really, I try to do that just to be transparent.
Okay, then I think today I will, because I have already this bunch of.
Oh, wow, good.
So I need to kind of like, yeah, make my brain more settle down to this product. And then I think after the meeting on Tuesday, and yeah, if I get to know the process better, and then I think I can, that's the perfect point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I'll stop recording.